The moment the bullies laid eyes on him, they thought it would be easy. A lone man, sitting quietly on a bench in the middle of the prison yard, looking calm, almost too calm. They had seen men like him before, new faces, quiet, seemingly harmless. But they didn't know what they were about to unleash. The tallest of the bullies, a man with a scar across his cheek and a permanent sneer, nudged his companions. "Hey, look at this old man," he laughed, his voice carrying across the yard. "Think he belongs here?" The other inmates turned their heads. A low murmur spread, but most were too busy keeping to themselves to intervene. The prison yard was tense that morning, the sun beating down, the metallic clanging of gates, the distant shouts of guards. But all of that faded for a moment as the bullies approached. Chuck Norris didn't move. He didn't flinch, didn't rise from the bench, didn't even acknowledge their presence at first. He simply watched them, calm and composed. His eyes were steady, unshaken, giving nothing away. That silence, the kind that feels heavier than 1,000 words, was already unnerving the bullies. "Hey, old man, you better watch your back around here," the tallest bully barked, stepping closer, trying to look intimidating. His friends snickered behind him, circling, eager to see him break. But Chuck Norris remained seated, arms resting lightly on his knees, fingers relaxed, demeanor unbothered. The bullies exchanged confused glances. They had expected fear, or at least some reaction. But there was nothing. Just calm. Just confidence. And that calm was louder than any threat. "You think you can just sit here, huh?" another bully taunted. "This yard isn't for your kind. Stand up. Fight or get out." Chuck slowly lifted his head, his eyes locking with the leader's. A faint smile touched his lips, not mocking, not angry, just a subtle hint of awareness. A warning without words. In that moment, the air changed. The other inmates stopped talking. Even the guards, distant and distracted, paused, sensing something extraordinary was unfolding. Because this wasn't just any man. This was Chuck Norris, a legend whose presence alone could command respect, whose skills in hand-to-hand combat were known far and wide, even in places where few dared to speak them aloud. And these bullies had just made a choice they would regret forever. The prison yard was alive with tension that morning, though most inmates tried to act nonchalant. Ironstone Prison was notorious for its hardened criminals, men who had spent years perfecting intimidation as an art form. And yet, today, something, or rather someone, disrupted that rhythm. Chuck Norris sat quietly on a weathered wooden bench, the sun glinting off the lines of his calm, unshaken face. His uniform was plain, standard prison issue, sleeves rolled neatly to his elbows, hands resting lightly on his knees. There were no flashy gestures, no brash announcements, no attempt to draw attention. Yet, somehow, the quiet gravity of his presence commanded notice. The bullies were already circling. The tallest one, scarred and sneering, took the lead. Two companions flanked him like shadows, grinning with cruel expectation. "So this is him, huh?" the leader said, almost to himself. "The legend thinks he can sit here like he owns the place." He stepped closer, deliberately brushing the tip of his shoe against Chuck's bench. "You better watch your back, old man," he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. His friends laughed, a hollow, cruel sound that bounced off the concrete walls surrounding the yard. Chuck didn't react. He didn't twitch or rise or even shift his gaze. He simply looked at them, calm, patient, like a man who knew exactly what was coming and was waiting for it. There was no fear, no hesitation. Just a quiet confidence that unnerved even the hardened criminals. The bullies took it as a challenge. One of them jabbed at Chuck's shoulder, testing the waters, expecting resistance. Instead, Chuck's eyes followed the movement smoothly, almost lazily. His hands stayed relaxed on his knees, his posture unmoved. And that silence, that stillness, made the bullies pause for a fraction of a second they would later wish they had spent elsewhere. "You think you're untouchable?" the leader barked, his patience thinning. "I've dealt with men like you before. Weak, old, easy targets. You're going to regret stepping into my yard." A faint smile appeared on Chuck's face. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even amusement. It was a subtle, calm warning, a quiet promise that anyone who underestimated him would learn the hard way. Other inmates had stopped their games. Conversations had died in mid-sentence. Even the guards glanced in the direction of the unfolding tension, noting the unnatural stillness around Chuck. There was something about him that commanded attention, something that made the air itself seem heavier, charged with anticipation. And that's when the leader made a mistake. He reached for Chuck's arm again, this time with more force, thinking he could push the man down and prove dominance. He didn't know the storm waiting beneath that calm exterior. Before Chuck moved, the yard had fallen silent. Even the sun seemed to pause. In the brief seconds before the storm, one thought ran through every inmate's mind. This man is no ordinary prisoner. Quick question for you. Have you ever stayed calm under pressure and shocked everyone around you? Drop a yes or no in the comments. I want to see who's got nerves of steel. The leader of the bullies didn't wait any longer. With a cruel smirk, he shoved Chuck Norris in the shoulder, expecting resistance, expecting fear, expecting a fight that would end quickly in his favor. But Chuck didn't flinch. He didn't even shift his weight. His calm gaze met the man's eyes, steady and unyielding, and in that moment, the bully felt a chill run down his spine. "You've made a mistake," Chuck said, his voice quiet but carrying an undeniable weight. It wasn't anger. It wasn't threat. It was certainty, a promise that whatever came next would not be pleasant. The second bully lunged from the side, swinging wildly. But Chuck moved like a shadow, his reflexes precise and measured. In one smooth motion, he sidestepped the attack, guiding the man past him with just enough force to throw him off balance. The inmate stumbled, crashing into a nearby bench, the impact echoing across the yard. The third bully, emboldened by the stumble, rushed forward with a raised fist. Chuck's eyes tracked him, calm and calculating. In a fluid motion, he intercepted the punch, twisting the man's wrist sharply and sending him sprawling to the concrete. Groans and grunts filled the yard as other inmates stopped mid-step, mouths open, watching what seemed impossible. The leader, now enraged, charged again. He underestimated the quiet strength of the man before him, thinking brute force could overpower skill. But Chuck was faster. He blocked, parried, and countered in a sequence so fluid it seemed choreographed, yet entirely spontaneous. Each movement was precise. One kick to the side, a sweep to the legs, a subtle push that sent the man tumbling forward. Silence swept across the yard. Even the guards paused, unsure if they should intervene. Every inmate could see it. Chuck Norris wasn't just defending himself. He was delivering a lesson, teaching respect through action rather than words. The three bullies scrambled to regain their footing, but their confidence had vanished. Fear had replaced arrogance. "Enough," Chuck said, his voice calm, almost gentle. "This doesn't need to go further." But the bullies, humiliated and desperate, tried again, a final, reckless charge. They collided into him, but Chuck's stance was unshakable. With a swift combination of a block, a precise strike, and a low sweep, all three fell to the ground in a heap, groaning and clutching limbs they hadn't thought possible to injure so quickly. The yard erupted into whispers, phones were pulled out, and eyes widened. Even those who had doubted Chuck's legend now understood the truth. He was more than a man. He was a force, a calm storm that no amount of bullying could provoke, a living lesson in discipline and skill. The leader crawled back to a sitting position, glaring but defeated. His pride was shattered. Who are you really?" he asked, voice trembling. Chuck simply stood, brushing off his sleeves. His calm demeanor never wavered. Someone who knows how to respect himself, and expects the same from others. In that instant, the yard's energy shifted. No one dared approach him again. Even the toughest inmates kept their distance, understanding that some battles were not worth the risk. Chuck Norris didn't need to threaten anyone. One silent demonstration had been enough. The three bullies had been humiliated, sprawled across the concrete, their pride shattered. But stubbornness and desperation ran deep in men who had spent their lives ruling through fear. They were not ready to admit defeat, not yet. The tallest bully, scarred and furious, slowly rose to his feet, wobbling slightly from the impact of Chuck's precise strikes. "This isn't over," he spat, rage dripping from every word. "You think you can just take us down and walk away?" Chuck Norris didn't flinch. He didn't move aggressively toward them. Instead, he shifted his stance slightly, feet grounded, arms relaxed but ready. His eyes scanned the yard, calm yet alert, weighing every possible movement. He wasn't just fighting for himself, He was fighting to establish a simple truth: respect is earned, and arrogance can be dangerous. The second bully charged from behind, swinging wildly again, hoping to catch Chuck off guard. But Chuck's reflexes were instantaneous. With a smooth pivot, he caught the man's arm mid-swing and twisted, guiding him in a circular motion that sent him crashing into a nearby trash bin. The sound echoed, and even the other inmates flinched. The third bully tried a low sweep, aiming to knock Chuck off balance, but Chuck anticipated it. In a single fluid motion, he jumped slightly, landing with perfect balance, then delivered a controlled push that sent the attacker sliding across the yard. It wasn't just brute force, it was skill, timing, and precision. Every movement was deliberate, every counter perfectly measured. The leader, now enraged beyond reason, grabbed a metal pipe from the ground. "Enough of your tricks," he shouted. "I'm going to break you this time." Chuck didn't speak. He didn't need to. One glance at him was enough to freeze even the most reckless of men. His calm presence radiated confidence, an unspoken warning that any attack would be met with consequences far beyond what the bullies had imagined. They lunged together, desperate, chaotic, and uncoordinated. Chuck's movements became a blur to anyone watching. A block here, a sweep there, a precise push, a controlled strike. The yard echoed with the sounds of impact, grunts, and shuffling feet. Each bully fell again, hard this time, sprawling in positions that made it clear. They were not merely losing, they were being outclassed entirely. Whispers ran through the remaining inmates. Phones came out, recording the spectacle. That's Chuck Norris," one voice muttered. "Legend says he's unstoppable. I think it's true." The guards finally moved closer, watching intently but knowing better than to intervene just yet. Even they could see that this wasn't about violence alone. It was about respect, discipline, and a lesson these men desperately needed. The leader crawled to his knees, chest heaving, eyes wild with disbelief. Chuck Norris stood several feet away, steady, calm, almost serene in his composure. "This yard isn't yours to control through fear," he said quietly. "It never was." The message landed like a hammer. The bullies had tested their strength, their dominance, and their arrogance, and had been proven entirely wrong. Their fear was no longer subtle, it was raw, undeniable, and humiliating. Other inmates, who had previously avoided the confrontation, now stepped back, giving Chuck a wide berth. Even the toughest among them understood. Some battles were not worth the risk. Respect wasn't given here, it was demanded through skill, patience, and unshakable calm. And Chuck Norris had just redefined it in one unforgettable display. By the time the dust settled, the yard was quiet again. The bullies were sprawled on the ground, defeated in body and spirit. The other inmates whispered to each other, awed. Even the guards, watching from a distance, exchanged knowing glances. One thing was clear: the day Chuck Norris arrived in the yard, nothing would ever be the same. The dust settled across the prison yard. The three bullies lay sprawled on the concrete, bruised and humiliated, their pride shattered. For a moment, there was silence, the kind of silence that feels heavier than any shout, heavier than any chaos that had filled the yard moments before. Inmates who had been playing cards, tossing a basketball, or just walking through the yard now froze in their tracks. Whispers spread like wildfire. "That's Chuck Norris. I can't believe what just happened. No one fights like that." Every eye was on him, not out of fear alone, but in awe of the calm precision, the unmatched skill, and the sheer authority of his presence. Even the guards, who had seen countless fights over the years, felt a shift. They had trained to maintain order, to intervene when necessary, but there was no need here. Chuck Norris wasn't just defending himself, he was delivering a lesson no one would forget. It was a lesson in respect, discipline, and the consequences of arrogance. The leader of the bullies struggled to his knees, clutching his ribs where Chuck had struck. His breathing was uneven, his pride demolished. Who are you?" he stammered, voice trembling, eyes wide. I've never seen anyone like you." Chuck walked toward him, slow, deliberate steps. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a dramatic gesture. Every movement radiated calm power. "I'm someone who understands strength," Chuck said softly. "And I expect respect. Not fear, not arrogance, just respect." The other two bullies, lying on the ground, attempted to rise but hesitated, clearly weighed down by both physical pain and the realization that their behavior had consequences far beyond what they had imagined. Even as they struggled, they kept glancing at Chuck, knowing full well that another aggressive move could leave them incapacitated completely. The inmates watching began to murmur among themselves. Some nodded subtly at each other, recognizing the lesson being taught. Others stepped a little farther back, clearing space around Chuck as if instinctively acknowledging that he commanded the yard in a way no one else could. Chuck turned his gaze slowly across the crowd, making eye contact with several of the toughest inmates. He didn't need to say a word. His calm confidence, his unwavering posture, and the knowledge that he had just dominated 3 of the fiercest bullies in the yard were enough to establish authority. The silent message was clear: disrespect him, or disrespect your own understanding of strength, and you will regret it. Even the guards couldn't hide their astonishment. One muttered under his breath, "I've never seen anything like that. He's unreal." Another simply shook his head, knowing that the day's events would be a story told in the prison for years to come. As Chuck started to walk toward the bench, giving the bullies space to recover and think, a hush settled over the yard. The fallen men were no longer the ones in control. Chuck had shifted the balance entirely. The energy in the yard had changed. Where once there had been arrogance and threat, now there was respect, awe, and even fear, a lesson imprinted deeply into the psyche of anyone watching. The leader finally crawled a few feet toward the wall, his friends close behind, unable to meet Chuck's gaze. Every muscle in his body ached, but the lesson had penetrated deeper than the pain. From that moment on, he and the others knew exactly who ruled respect in that yard. It wasn't fear. It wasn't intimidation. It was calm, deliberate, and unparalleled skill. It was Chuck Norris. The remaining inmates slowly returned to their routines, but their eyes never left him. Phones were raised discreetly to record this legend in action. Stories would spread, whispers would turn into full tales, and the prison yard would never be the same again. Chuck had arrived, not as a man seeking trouble, but as a man reminding everyone of one simple truth: respect is earned, not demanded, and it can come silently, until it's too late. Quick audience check. Have you ever faced someone who completely changed the room with just calm confidence? Comment, "Yes, I felt it," or "No, never." Let's see who's experienced real authority. The yard had finally returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the air was still heavy with awe and disbelief. Chuck Norris, calm as ever, walked slowly toward the bench where he had been sitting earlier. His movements were deliberate, measured, exuding authority without aggression. Every step spoke of experience, discipline, and quiet power, the kind that demanded respect without a single raised voice. The 3 bullies, now nursing bruises and shattered pride, slouched near the wall, their eyes fixed on him. They had tested what they thought was a legend, and the reality had hit them harder than any punch or kick ever could. Even the most hardened inmates, who had watched countless fights and conflicts in Ironstone Prison, found themselves unable to look away. Chuck Norris wasn't just a fighter. He was a force, a presence, and a living lesson in control. As Chuck approached, the leader of the bullies finally muttered, barely audible, I get it now. I shouldn't have." Chuck stopped a few feet away, his calm eyes locking with the man's. "You shouldn't have what?" he asked, his tone gentle but firm. "You shouldn't have underestimated someone. You shouldn't have thought disrespect goes unpunished. Or perhaps, you shouldn't have forgotten what respect really means." The man swallowed hard, his chest rising and falling quickly as he struggled to maintain composure. There was no bravado left, only a dawning realization that his arrogance had been misplaced. His companions mirrored his expression, the shame and fear evident in their faces. "Now listen carefully," Chuck continued, his voice carrying across the yard without the need to shout. "Strength is not measured by how loud you can be, how many people you can intimidate, or how many times you can push others around. True strength," he said, motioning to the yard, "is in control, discipline, patience, knowing when to act and when to remain calm. That is what makes a man powerful." Even the guards, who had initially been skeptical about intervening, nodded subtly, impressed by the clarity and authority in Chuck's words. The other inmates shifted uneasily, many lowering their heads in silent acknowledgement. The 3 bullies finally understood. It wasn't just the physical defeat they had suffered, it was a deeper, more permanent lesson about arrogance, respect, and consequences. Chuck turned his attention to the yard itself. "From this day forward," he said, "no one earns fear through threats or intimidation here. Anyone who chooses to act with arrogance, who tries to dominate others, will learn the hard way, but anyone who shows respect, for themselves and for others, will earn their place." A hush settled over the yard. Inmates exchanged glances, some quietly nodding to each other. Even the once bold bullies now slouched in shame, absorbing the magnitude of the lesson. They had thought Chuck Norris was just a man. Now they knew he was a principle, a standard of behavior that demanded acknowledgement. He finally returned to his bench, sitting with the same calm posture as before. The sunlight caught the lines of his face, highlighting the quiet authority that needed no demonstration beyond the events of the past hour. The yard, once chaotic and tense, now radiated an order that was invisible but undeniable. Respect had been restored, and it had been earned through action, not words. The bullies, still on the ground, dared not approach. They knew better than to challenge someone like Chuck again. They had faced the legend, and their defeat was more than physical, it was spiritual. Every other inmate in the yard had witnessed the demonstration. A silent code had been written. Chuck Norris commanded the respect of Ironstone Prison, and anyone who crossed him or those who upheld order would face consequences they could not anticipate. As Chuck leaned back slightly, stretching his arms over his knees, he glanced around the yard one last time. The whispers continued, but now they carried awe instead of derision. Phones were lowered. Eyes followed him, not with anticipation of chaos, but with recognition of a standard that had been set. For the bullies, the lesson would last far longer than their physical pain. They would remember the precision, the calm, the authority, and the price of disrespect. And for the rest of the yard, a new rule had emerged. True power is silent, true respect is earned, and anyone who underestimates the quiet man is inviting consequences they cannot escape. Chuck Norris stood, dusted his uniform, and gave a final nod, not of triumph, but of acknowledgement. The yard had learned its lesson. And then, without a word, he walked toward the gate, leaving behind not just defeated bullies, but a legacy of respect, strength, and calm authority that would resonate long after the echoes of the fight had faded. The prison yard was quiet now, but it wasn't the quiet of emptiness. It was the quiet that follows a storm, a tense, electric stillness, filled with awe and reflection. Chuck Norris had walked through chaos and emerged not only unscathed but as a living embodiment of respect, discipline, and silent authority. The echoes of the scuffles, the grunts, the thuds, and the gasps still lingered in the air, but it was his calm presence that remained as the dominant force. Inmates who had once strutted arrogantly, believing they ruled the yard through fear, now kept their distance. They whispered to each other, recounting every move, every measured strike, every subtle shift in Chuck's stance. It wasn't just a fight they had witnessed, it was a lesson in life, compressed into a single, unforgettable display. Chuck sat on the bench for a moment, catching his breath, but even then, he did not appear triumphant or angry. There was no satisfaction in humiliation, no joy in dominance. He was simply present, a calm force amidst a world of chaos, showing that strength was not loud, not flashy, not aggressive. True strength, he demonstrated, was patient, deliberate, and disciplined. The three bullies, once full of arrogance and threats, were now sprawled near the wall, defeated not only physically but mentally. Pride is a fragile thing, and Chuck had shattered theirs without raising his voice, without a single unnecessary movement. They had learned, painfully and permanently, that arrogance and disrespect come at a price, a lesson that would stay with them far longer than the bruises on their bodies. Even the other inmates, some who had been indifferent or even hostile, felt a shift within themselves. The story of what had happened would travel quickly through Ironstone Prison. Chuck Norris had set a standard that spoke louder than words. Respect is earned, not demanded. Power lies in control, not chaos. Confidence is silent, and arrogance is loud. Chuck rose slowly from the bench. His movements were deliberate, measured, and calm, a silent message to anyone still watching. The lesson was over, but the standard remained. No one would dare to test him again, not because of fear alone, but because they now understood the principle behind his strength. The bullies, the other inmates, even some of the guards who had observed from a distance, knew this. Chuck Norris had changed the dynamic of the yard forever. As he walked toward the gate, he glanced around the yard one last time. Some inmates straightened involuntarily, caught in the magnetic pull of his presence. Others murmured to each other, repeating the story of the fight, the calm, the skill, and the lesson. In the prison yard, a silent respect had been established, and it would endure. The truth that Chuck demonstrated was simple but profound. Respect is not something to be demanded or forced through intimidation. True power does not rely on aggression, threats, or fear. It is quiet. It is measured. It is precise. And most importantly, it is earned through action, discipline, and integrity. In a place like Ironstone Prison, where chaos and fear often dictate behavior, this lesson was revolutionary. Life, like the yard that day, can be unpredictable and filled with challenges. People may try to intimidate you, test your patience, or belittle your presence. But the key to navigating these trials is the same principle Chuck exhibited. Stay calm, stay grounded, and never let arrogance or disrespect dictate your response. Strength is not in the loudest shout or the hardest strike. It is in maintaining control when others lose theirs, in teaching through example rather than words, and in letting your actions speak louder than any threats could. As Chuck reached the gate and prepared to leave, the inmates silently acknowledged the unspoken truth. They had witnessed more than a fight. They had witnessed mastery. They had witnessed a lesson that extended far beyond the yard, beyond the prison walls, into the principles that govern behavior, discipline, and respect in life itself. The three bullies, still recovering, stared after him, humbled and forever changed. The other inmates whispered stories that would spread to every corner of the prison. The guards, too, felt a shift, a reminder that control, patience, and respect often speak louder than force or authority alone. Chuck Norris left the yard quietly, but the impression he left was anything but quiet. It lingered in the eyes of every inmate, in the whispers of awe and respect, and in the understanding that strength is measured not by dominance, but by control. True power is silent. True respect is earned. And arrogance, no matter how loud, is always revealed for what it is, temporary and fragile. Quick audience check. Have you ever stayed calm in a situation where others lost their cool? Comment, "I stayed calm," or "I lost it." I want to see who's got nerves of steel.